I'd like to call the regular Comox Valley Regional District Board meeting of Tuesday, June 15th, 2021 to order. And we're on the unceded traditional territory of the Comox First Nation. And today we're going to read Article 34 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Indigenous peoples have the right to promote, develop, and maintain their institutional structures and their distinctive customs, spirituality, traditions, procedures, practices, and in the cases where they exist, judicial systems or customs in accordance with international human rights and standards. And we are going to go to in camera following the regular board meeting under sections 91K and 91A of the Community Charter. Thank you, Hillian and Arbor. Anyone opposed? That's carried. And we move on to adoption of minutes from May 25th. Moran and Hillian, thank you. Anyone opposed to adoption of minutes? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried. And we're on to delegations. And today we have the Island Corridor Foundation, Larry Stevenson, the CIO, and I think we have some additional members on the call as well. Councillor Charlene Everson. And was there a third? And Andrea Thomas. Oh, and Todd Boychuk. So welcome to all of you. And can I get a motion to receive delegation? Arbor and McCollum, thank you. And Larry, are you there?
I am here.
Great. Welcome.
Thank you. Are you going to turn my camera on or do you want me to leave it off?
That's up to you.
Okay. Well, it says here I can't turn it on. It says that the host has stopped it.
Okay, I'll just check in with staff. Okay. Yep, the PowerPoint is up. You can proceed and we'll work on your camera for you. All
right, sounds good. First of all, good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's been some time since I was here last, and I know we have limited time, so I've got a lot to cover, so I'm just going to dive right in. So next slide, please. So our talk today is going to focus primarily on two things. It's going to be a status update on the corridor. We'll talk about the key developments. We're going to talk about our activities over the past year, and then I'll address some of the issues raised in the Friends of Rails to Trails presentation that you had in March of 2021. Next slide, please. Like most organizations, we were impacted by COVID. Fortunately, we did not experience a large economic loss. We did, however, have a limited ability to communicate. We had to take a step back from our public engagement, which is crucial to our mission in our view. That includes getting in front of our stakeholders like you and the rest of the regional districts and some of our First Nations. In recognition of the situation, we stepped back from advocacy work, at the provincial level. We felt that it just wasn't an appropriate time to push hard. I mean, government at all levels had their hands full, and we knew that, and there was bigger issues, so we didn't want to appear tone deaf. But despite those things, despite COVID, there were a number of developments in 2020. Next slide, please. I think the biggest one, of course, was the Island Rail Corridor Condition Assessment. The province released the report in April of 2020. This was a thorough assessment by professionals. It was conducted by railway industry experts, and that's important. It was important to us that it was done by people who understand railroads and have built them. It provided a complete and accurate picture of the railway infrastructure from the ties and track to the grade crossing and the bridges. Our analysis of the report found that the baseline construction costs in the report are accurate. However, in our view, some of the methodology used to estimate those actual costs is deeply flawed, resulting in serious overestimate of the actual cost of construction. By way of example, if you look through the report, it includes a 97% contingency factor that effectively doubles the cost of construction. We don't know how those contingencies were arrived at, and the province has been silent on them since the report's release. Next slide, please. The assessment was designed to provide costs for multiple levels of service and a standalone commuter system. The report came back with costs ranging from $326 billion to $1.3 billion. This was a highly technical report that requires some interpretation to understand exactly what was being proposed. The need for interpretation is clear when you consider the massive cost differential between 326 and 1.3 billion. Next slide, please. The province provided no comments or interpretation of the findings. They released it and walked away from it. That resulted in an immediate focus on the highest cost levels and left many to conclude that the cost of restoring service was just too high. And you know, at a cost of 1.3 billion, we would agree. You know, however, those costs relate to a level of service that is far more than what is required today. There's simply no need for a standalone commuter system in the CRD that would see 24 trains per day, nor is there a need for a regional train service with 8 trains per day to Courtney. Using the baseline numbers from the assessment, our estimate of the cost to restore service is somewhere in the area of $300 to $350 million. That estimate will deliver a level of service that is tailored to the unique needs of each of our regions, and it's going to meet the demands of today while providing the base for expansion for tomorrow as required. Next slide, please. The other key event in 2020 was the decision by the BC Supreme Court regarding our case with the Snutnawas. The court dismissed the claim against the ICF, and there was a key finding in that case, and that's if the corridor is not used or held for railway purposes, it may be subject to reversion. And I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. As you may know, the case has been appealed. The appeal was heard on May 16th and 17th, and we expect we'll see a decision probably in the next 6 months. Next slide, please. In September 2020, we conducted an island-wide survey of the public to gauge the level of interest in rail on the island. The survey was widely advertised, and it promoted and resulted in over 3,000 responses. The survey covered a wide range of topics, and while I won't go through them on the slide, you can see their support averaging about 80%. Public support for rail is clear. The public wants to see rail service restored to the island. And when you combine that with the support we have from BC Chambers of Commerce, AVICC, and the mayors, it's apparent that the rail system is widely supported on the island. Next slide, please. So just out of interest, I've included some numbers here for the North Island. Support on the North Island came in about 68%. That's not surprising that it's a little lower than the rest. It's harder for people to embrace the vision of rail the further you get from Victoria. But 68% support is still pretty strong for the Comox Valley. Next slide. So given the economic impact of COVID that it's had on our island, we wanted to understand the immediate economic benefit of just the construction that it would have on our economy. So we've commissioned a report that was authored by Van Struth Consulting and used a base investment of $304 million. They determined that the economic impact of that would be $147 million in labor income, 2,200 person years of employment, and $470 million in total economic benefit. The report estimates that 85% of those expenditures for this project would be in British Columbia and benefit British Columbians and many here on Vancouver Island. There's no doubt that moving forward with this project would be a boost for our local economies at a time when we need it most. Next slide, please. In 2021, we turned our attention back to making the case for rail. I recently met with the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure, Rob Fleming. He's a new minister. He's engaged. He's interested. He's certainly interested in rail. It's a new portfolio for him, though. So this was to some extent an educational meeting. It was very positive. I think he walked away with a better understanding of rail and why it's important to the island. We have requested the minister consider a working group to review next steps, and we're awaiting his response. Next slide, please. I watched the presentation made by Friends of Rails to Trails in March. I'm going to quickly cover a few of the points made in their presentation. We'll sprung to each of them. Their vision is essentially treat the corridor as abandoned and tear up the tracks, make the entire corridor an active transportation corridor. To support their case, they make the following arguments: that the cost to restore rail is prohibitive, projected ridership is minimal, and that the Snutnawas case was decided on a technicality. They also state they recognize the importance of First Nations in the discussion about the corridor, and they advance the trail could be a tool in advancing reconciliation, and they're prepared to work with our First Nations to find mutually beneficial solutions. Next slide, please. So let's talk a minute about active transportation corridor only. You know, we understand and support the movement to active transportation. That's why we support trails alongside the tracks. That being said, we do not believe that making this corridor into a trail will address the transportation issues that we are experiencing today, and certainly not for the future. We are already experiencing a congestion problem on the island, particularly in the south. You know, the province is forecasting that by 2038, it's going to take 2 hours and 24 minutes to go from Mill Bay to Victoria. We live in a highly sought after place, and given population growth, things are going to get worse. The trail doesn't address that particular issue. I think it's important to keep in mind that the decisions we're making today are going to impact us for the next 50 years, and that includes the entire island. Equally important, our environmental goals are dependent upon modal shift. Getting people out of cars is the only way we're ever going to meet our GHG targets. Rail represents the single biggest opportunity to make that happen. The ICS vision is a multi-purpose transportation corridor. The corridor must serve everyone. We should not limit its use to only to those that are physically capable to do so. And again, we can have both. We already have over 100 kilometers of trail completed. Removing the tracks forever is going to limit the future use of this corridor. Once those tracks are gone, the corridor is going to be gone. Next slide, please. So let's talk a minute about the costs and the notion that it's prohibitive. First, let me say, we understand that every single dollar of taxpayer money is important. We don't take the expense of this project lightly. Our estimate is $300 to $350 million will be the cost to restore rail to the island. Some say that's expensive and too expensive, and fair enough. But, I would ask, it's expensive as compared to what? If you look at the Mackenzie interchange, it was $100 million. If you look at the rail projects on the mainland, the 16-kilometer Surrey extension is $4.3 billion. The 5.7-kilometer Broadway extension, $2.83 billion. So the mainland extensions amount to $340 million per kilometer. The island rail corridor, on the other hand, is $1.24 million per kilometer. So we're literally a rounding error. That returns service to the entire island. It's intercity, it's commuter, it's freight, it's excursion. Fort VI raised the question, about ridership. I can tell you we have questions about that too. When you look at the report, the assessment used data from BC Transit Express buses operating Duncan to Victoria to determine the Courtenay to Victoria ridership. That's some bent logic. They also took a point of view that because of the timing of the train scenarios, they didn't include the ridership for people that were actually moving in the corridor. So we don't necessarily understand how they arrived at those numbers either. The province has never explained them. We've asked for that explanation, but I would suggest to you that BC Transit data in the Duncan corridor has little to do with Comox Valley. Next slide, please. So let's talk a minute about the Snot-Nawas case, and this is extremely important. This case was not decided on a technicality. The ruling by the BC Supreme Court is going to be extremely important for the future of the corridor. I'm not sure how Fort VI came to the conclusion that it was a technicality, but the SNA case is based on the taking of the land for railway purposes. If the land is not being used for railway purposes, it may be subject to reversion to its original owners. And that's not just First Nations owners, that's all owners. The decision of the court was the land is being held for railway purposes, and the implication of that ruling is clear. Remove the tracks or use the corridor for anything other than railway purposes, and it will be subject to reversion. This is not a risk that any of us should be willing to take. The loss of this corridor would be detrimental to and for everyone for generations to come. Next slide, please. In their presentation, the Fort VI folks spent some time talking about reconciliation in the corridor, and that is something we know a little bit about. As the ICF is by design a project in reconciliation. It was First Nations who first recognized the need to maintain this corridor, and it was First Nations who were the impetus for the formation of the ICF. The ongoing management and direction of the ICF is a shared responsibility among First Nations and the regional districts. Our board has equal representation of First Nations members and regional districts members. While we recognize that Fort VI believe a trail is a great example of reconciliation, our First Nation partners want to see rail restored. Do they all agree? No, but to be sure, it's rail that they want to see. Next slide, please. So to quickly summarize, the Island Rail Corridor is a vital transportation asset. This is an asset that belongs to all of us. It should serve all of us. We are committed to a multi-use corridor that includes rails and trails. And why would we want to limit its use? We can have both. And we have invited the folks at Fort VI to work with us. However, to date, they've been unwilling to do so. The cost of restoring rail service is reasonable, and it is a good investment for BC. It is an investment in our collective future with immediate economic benefit to British Columbia. Rail should play a key role in the comprehensive transportation network for this island, for today and for the future. We do agree with Fort VI, though, that we are at a strategic crossroads. It's time to think differently, and it's time to move forward with rail. There may come a day when we consider making the corridor a trail, but that time is not today. Thank you for this opportunity, and I'd be happy to take any questions you may have.
Great, thanks so much for that presentation. And we do have some questions, starting with Director Hanier.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for the presentation. I just wanted to clarify the quote that you've given of just a little bit over $350 million. Is that a rail line from Victoria to Courtenay, or is this the whole line, or what does that represent?
That is the entire corridor. So it would be rail restored all the way from Victoria to Courtenay, and as well as from Parksville over to Port Alberta.
Okay, well, that's great. I mean, that's probably the lowest I've ever seen in terms of a line, you know, the quotation for the line. And the fact that you're looking at the entire line all the way up to here. I'm just wondering where you're at now in terms of, you know, moving forward, funding. What is it? Do you have a timeline?
Um, that's the $1 million question, or I guess the $350 million question. You know, when we start talking about costs, and I think one of the problems that we've run into over the years is that there's been too many costs. There's been too many numbers thrown out there. There's been too much confusion. And when you go through this, one of the things that we were extremely happy with the assessment is it is based on realistic numbers. When you break it down to the actual costs, it's realistic. Where we stray from the report is, you know, when you start talking about a 97% contingency and effectively doubling the cost of the project, that doesn't make a lot of sense to us. So, you know, when I met with the minister, you know, I had asked him, I said, you know, you've made the comment that unfortunately rail is expensive. And so can you tell me, is it expensive compared to what? And he didn't really have a good answer for that. You know, and I think it's because what happened is when they released the information on the report, a lot of people said, wow, 1.3 billion. And, you know, fair enough. I mean, that's a big number. And I think everybody kind of sat back when that happened. So where are we now? I mean, we've been in front of the minister. We've asked him to set up a group because there's a lot of work that needs to get done even before you start talking about building this railroad. I mean, you get into all kinds of discussion about governance and who owns it and who runs it and how does it run. All of that stuff needs to be sorted out. So we've asked the province to at least get started on that process so that we can move forward with a funding proposal.
Thank you. Next, we have Director McCullum.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for the presentation, Larry. There's some really interesting information that you've provided, and I'm getting a better sense of where the Island Corridor Foundation is hoping we end up. I had some questions about the 325 million figure. From what I understand, when we've had reports to local government, generally a higher contingency amount just represents less certainty in the figures that are being provided in the report, which would make sense because this is a very complex thing that we're talking about. So, I mean, it doesn't shock me that we could have a margin of uncertainty that's fairly substantial when we're talking about getting rail up and going, especially after it's not been in use for so long. I'm curious about this $300 million figure. What that kind of service would look like. Like, is that for trains that traveled at the previous speed? I think it was 40 kilometers an hour. And would that be just to have the trains functional, or is that partly to get an actual service up and going, or is that just talking about the train tracks themselves?
Good question, and thank you for that. First of all, let me say one thing about how complex this is. I've worked in the rail industry for 20 years, and I can tell you there's not many things in the world that are as simple as railroads. Railroads are very simple animals when you talk about the engineering, and particularly when you look at a situation where you have a corridor, you know, that's already in place. And yes, it's been there for 130 years, but it hasn't changed a whole lot. And updating this line and bringing it up to a service level that would be, you know, useful in today's environment is really not that complex, and it's really not that difficult. So I kind of take a step back from the issue of it being complex and therefore more expensive and more risk. In fact, I would suggest to you that there's less risk here than there is in almost any other transportation project, because we're not worried about environmental issues. We're not worried about water courses. We're not worried about all the normal things that you run into in engineering, because it's already there. It already exists. So those are known to us. On the issue of what does it deliver, the $326 million number, just so that you're aware, was the lowest number quoted in the assessment. That's not a number that we're talking about. When we talk about $300 to $350 million, we're talking about essentially an intermediate level service as defined in the assessment. That's going to provide a rail service that's going to be fast enough that people are going to want to use it. You know, the lowest level of service that they provided in that report, nobody's going to want to do that. You're talking about trains moving at 10 or 15 miles an hour. At that intermediate level, you're talking about train speeds that are approaching 40 miles an hour. And I know, you know, when the Rails to Trails folks were talking about it, they talked about, oh, it's an antiquated Victorian era system. And they talked about the limitations of the track. What they didn't talk about was that if you look at an average commuter system anywhere in North America, the average speed of a commuter system isn't anywhere near 50 or 60 miles an hour. It's 30 miles an hour. So, you know, this system is going to provide an adequate system that people are going to want to use, and it's going to deliver people quickly, and it's going to be attractive for them to use it. Is it going to be 60 miles an hour? No. I mean, I wish we could do that, but we simply can't. But it's probably going to be more between 30 and 40 miles per hour, depending upon the location of the track. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that was a great answer. And I guess it kind of highlights the other question that I had in my mind, that, you know, I think a lot of what we're hearing about this asset and the service that it could provide it makes a lot of sense in the South Island, where commuter distances are quite a bit shorter.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking, you know, connecting Duncan to downtown Victoria. Most people would probably be happy to travel between 50 and 70 kilometers an hour if it means that they're not stuck in traffic and not having to park their vehicle downtown Victoria when they arrive at work. But making that kind of distance from Courtenay, it starts to look less like a service that would make sense. And I also think about just how less reliant people have become in the last 20 years on using, you know, public forms of transportation. Someone was reminding me recently that in the 90s, we used to have a full bus terminal on the corner not far from where we're sitting. And now our needs to get, you know, up and down the island and get people to the ferry terminals are serviced by basically big vans. So I guess my question for you is there any discussion at the Island Corridor Foundation around whether or not the solutions and the opportunities for this asset are different, say, south of Nanaimo as north?
I guess what I would say in response to that is that, you know, we certainly recognize that there's a vast differential between the different regions. You know, this is a different rail service in Courtenay than it is in the CRD. You know, the CRD, you are talking essentially about mass transit. When you're talking north, you're talking regional stuff. And, you know, I respect what you're saying about, you know, how times have changed. And I guess I would suggest to you that we're going to have to figure out how to change back. And the reason I say that, of course, is because when you look at greenhouse gas emissions and you look at where we're going with the environment, we can't continue to support what we're doing. I mean, we need to get people out of cars. We need to get them out of their private vehicles and using some other form of transportation. And that's kind of the biggest, I think, the biggest reason why we are not in favor of a trail only type situation. You know, we've lost our buses, we've lost kind of mass transportation. And now we're talking about doing things like putting buses out on the highway. Transit buses between places like Comox and Nanaimo. And that, to me, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You know, we're going to do more of the same things and try to get a different result. And I'm not so sure that's going to happen. You know, I think the train does provide an alternative service level. I think there's a huge demand for it. And I think it would be widely used once implemented. And, you know, we go all over the island. One of the things we hear all the time, particularly from younger people, is they don't have a desire to drive. You know, they're saying, look, I don't want to spend $4,000 a year on insurance. And I don't want to have to worry about a car. I want to get on a train, or I want to get on a bus. I want to do something different because I'm not going to get a driver's license. You know, and again, you know, as I said in the presentation, I think one of the things that you really have to kind of take into consideration here is that this isn't a discussion about today or tomorrow, really. This is a discussion about 50, 60 years from today. And that's going to come relatively fast. And, you know, this island is growing and it's going to keep growing, and all that growth is coming your way. So I think you're going to need this in the future.
I 100% agree with you that we need to provide transportation alternatives for people to get out of their cars. I'm having a hard time imagining how a train service that comes in frequently to the North Island is going to solve that. And I think you're right, 50 years out from now, that could be a different scenario. But I think like the electrification of the bus system and frequent trips are probably going to get us there sooner. And I know I've taken up a lot of time here, so I'm going to pass it over, but I just had one more question for you. And that's, I mean, you did speak to the idea of trail with rail, but I just want to clarify that the $350 million figure is just for rail. You're not considering what it would cost to add, say, I'm thinking in our region, like Union Bay to Courtenay, we have a pretty high old trestle that goes over the Trent, and those would be additional costs.
Yeah, the cost that we're using is only for the rehabilitation of the rail service. But I would say that, you know, if we're going to go down this path, if we're going to spend the money fixing the track, we should probably do the trail at the same time. You know, I don't know why we wouldn't. If, you know, if it's trails that we really want to have, then we should probably promote that. We should probably do that.
Agreed. Thanks for answering my questions.
Thank you.
Thanks. And Director Cole-Hamilton's been very patient. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for the report, Larry. I'm afraid I can't turn on my camera either, otherwise I would show my face. But I had some questions about the level of service, and I think a lot of those have been answered by Director McCollum's questions. One of the things that, and perhaps I'm wrong, can you tell me that my understanding is that the cost and level of engineering complexity on the Nanaimo to Courtenay segment is higher than the segment per kilometer, say, than the segment going from Nanaimo to Victoria. And I think it's probably also fair to say, given the sort of the speeds you were talking about, that usage might be lower on that segment, given that it would take probably 5 or 6 hours to get to Victoria from Courtenay at the speeds you were talking about. I just wanted to just get your assessment of whether there are substantially different costs per kilometer to bring things up to standard on the Nanaimo North part versus the Nanaimo South part.
You know, I don't have the exact answer for that, but I would say from my experience, just being out on the track, that the level of engineering complexity is probably greater south of Nanaimo than it is north of Nanaimo. We have much, you know, when you look at the track system going north of Nanaimo from Parksville going north, there's a good portion of that is fairly straight. When you look south, it's not. Of course, we have the biggest trestles on the system that are running south of Nanaimo. So, but you know, I can't tell you that I know that for fact. That would only be a guess on my part, that it would be more complex.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for that. And my other question is, we were talking a little bit earlier about contingencies, that the 97% contingency you felt was unduly high. Can I ask what contingency you used for the $304 million total that you came to?
30%.
30%. And can I ask where you derived that figure? Like, what was the basis?
Well, we essentially used what I would consider to be a kind of a normal construction contingency that I've seen used throughout the rail industry. You know, and when you look at the 97% contingency that they built into the assessment, you know, things jump out at you. Like there's, I think, $15 million set aside for the province to manage the project. We don't understand that. Like, I don't know why you would pay the province $15 million to manage a project that belongs to the province. You know, there's a number of those types of things built within that contingency. And, you know, there's an engineering management cost, and there's all of these different costs that we quite frankly don't understand. And we've asked for clarification. When I brought that up to the minister, I said, you know, how many projects do you have currently on the books today that have a 97% contingency? And he smiled and said, I don't think we have any. And I said, I don't think you do. And you better not. You know, I mean, those are the kind of things that we should be, you know, doing. 97% contingency. I would suggest you have the wrong people there if you need 97% contingencies to do the work.
Okay, thanks. So you went, the $304 million includes a 30% contingency on the cost that you calculated.
Correct. You know, when we say 304 to 350 million, we're also building in there some space for equipment and other things as well, which is not contained in the assessment. So I would, you know, on the safety side, if I was pushed into a corner, I'd say count on it being $350 million, and you're probably going to have it in hand.
Okay, thank you. And I just have one last question, if that's all right. Just given the level of service you're talking about, the sort of 30 to 40 miles an hour, when you did the survey, which showed people's support for rail service, did you ask them about the likelihood of usage at that level of service, at that speed?
No, we didn't
use it.
No, we didn't give them a particular you know, speed level, but you have to remember that the train has a few advantages. I mean, it's nonstop, right? So it's going to move fairly quickly through there. And, when I say 30 to 40 miles per hour, I'm talking about different areas. There are areas that we could go much faster, once the track is upgraded. It's not a straight, you're going to do 40 kilometers an hour all the way across, or 40 miles an hour all the way across. It's going to vary.
And just as a final follow-up, just on that one thing, do you have a sense of roughly how long it would take to get from where we are now, from Courtney to Victoria, based upon that kind of level of service, the $300 to $350 million price tag?
I've not done that calculation. I don't have it here with me. As a matter of fact, this summer I have two summer students coming in that are going to build a complete model. It's going to show the speed. It's going to show, a timetable. It's going to have costs. It's going to have all of that stuff built in, because that is a big question mark for a lot of folks.
Well, that sounds useful. It would be interesting to hear back when that's completed. Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we have one last question for you, Larry, before we let you off the hook here.
Okay.
Director Moore?
Great. Thank you, Larry, for the presentation. I wanted to chat a little bit about the survey results. I've taken a peek at them. I'm trying to get a sense of where the respondents were from primarily. So that's the first question.
I don't have that breakdown with me, but I can certainly get it to you.
Okay. I'm taking a look through the summary and things here, but I can't seem to find it. Oh, here we go. Regional views. I guess I'm sort of looking at that, aside from restoring the tracks, et cetera, the whole business case and sort of support for this idea. I know you've provided some of the information on the survey and the needs assessment, but I guess I sort of echoing some of the questions that have come up in terms of the price per ride. You mentioned young people in particular are less likely to want to drive and to use this type of transportation. Having said that, I know that as an example, maybe, VIU students coming up to Courtney or whatever, if it's cost prohibitive, then that's not going to necessarily bring that ridership. I mean, I've been around since, long enough to have taken the old train, and it was really a, you definitely didn't want to have an appointment in Victoria because it took forever. And if you had three little boys, as I did, on the train, the one time we all took the train together, you were kind of pulling your hair out by the end of it because they didn't serve drinks like they do in Europe. So, I think in terms of commuting from this location, I mean, really, I can see the allure of this more as a tourist type situation rather than, using it to get to medical appointments, et cetera. So I guess I would like to see more feedback, I guess. I mean, I appreciate the survey, but to me, there's a lot of pieces missing. And in terms of kind of that business case for particularly folks in our part of the island of how utilized this would be. So I don't know if you have anything more to add on that. But again, I just think that the feasibility maybe isn't there for this part of the island. I would like to dig into the survey a bit more to find out how many folks from this area did participate. Thanks.
Okay, so I'll try to cover some of those things. You've covered a number of things. So let's, I guess, start with the survey. I just, while you were talking, I went back and looked at the numbers. We actually got about 3,500 responses, and we took 500 of the responses out because they were from off the island. Approximately 20% of the responses came from the North Island. So approximately 600 responses came from the North Island. On the issue of, the cost, I think one of the things that we kind of need to get our head around is that for some reason in Canada, whenever we talk about rail, everybody talks about cost. Everybody wants to know exactly what it's going to cost them, and that for some reason they don't ask the same question when it comes to a bus. They don't ask the same question when it comes to a ferry. And, this system is likely going to have to be subsidized. by the government. There's a good chance that we can make up a lot of that with freight traffic that's coming out of Port Alberni. You know, you have a woefully underused terminal up there that with rail would likely grow and expand and bring money to the railroad. And, you know, when I look at subsidies, you know, across the board, you know, BC ferries, you know, you're talking $47 for every resident of BC is paying for BC ferries and $51 for BC Transit. You know, if you extend that out to the highway system, and the amount of subsidy per BC resident, it's actually $100 a year. So I think, you know, we have to kind of get our head around the idea that this is likely going to have to be a subsidized system. But, you know, transportation systems are often subsidized. And, you know, I'm not going to suggest that this is going to pay for itself, because it very well may not. On the issue of, you know, people traveling up and down the island, you're right. I don't expect anybody that's going to use this system for a commuter system into Victoria from Courtenay. The distances are just too far, but they're also too far when you drive. You know, we hear from a lot of folks. We hear from a lot of elderly folks, as an example, that don't want to make the drive, but they need to. They have to get to Victoria. They've got to go for appointments, and they're making overnight trips, and they're doing those things. So is it going to be, you know, it's not going to be a rocket to Victoria, but it's going to be another method to get to Victoria. And is it going to be perfect? Probably not. Is it going to suit everybody? Probably not, but it's going to suit a lot of people. You know, there was a lot of people that used the system even when it ran backwards, which is what everybody tells me it did before it shut down. You know, it started in the wrong place and it finished in the wrong place. So I think we have an opportunity here to change those things and to build a better system. I mean, we're not talking about building the same system. You know, that's not at all what this is about. This is about a very different system. Even if you look at the slides, if you look down at the bottom, you see the kind of trains that we're talking about. You know, this is today's stuff. But no, it's not going to address everybody, to answer your question. You're not wrong about that.
Thank you, Larry. It looks like the chair is going to allow me another question. It's my understanding that the provinces have not been interested in subsidizing. And I guess when I think about the outlay before we even get to people being on the train, huge outlay of costs, and then further subsidize, you know, getting to that point and then further subsidization. I'm just wondering how realistic it is. Are you able to comment on whether you've got
Sure. And I guess I would suggest to you that we don't seem to have a problem figuring out how to subsidize what's going on the mainland. You know, and to me, that's picture perfect. I mean, that tells a story in and of itself. We don't have a problem with the amount of money we're spending on the mainland, but somehow we have a problem here. And, you know, when you talk about provinces and subsidizing, the rest of the world is looking at developing their rail systems. And for some reason in BC, we don't seem to want to do that. If you look at Alberta, they're talking about building a rail system from Banff all the way to their airport. Ontario announced last week a major project to build to Northern Ontario through the ONR. Those will all be subsidized systems, but they're doing them because they recognize that, you know, if we're going to meet our environmental goals and we're going to efficiently move people, we're going to have to do it differently. We can't continue to do the same things and expect to get the same result or get a different result. It's just not going to happen. So I would suggest that, yeah, there's a lot of discussion going on about rail, maybe not in British Columbia, which I find a little dismaying, but I think we're going to get there. I think that discussion is going to happen, and it's going to happen sooner than you might think.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for the presentation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, have a good evening. We're not done talking about rail yet, as our next delegation is also on trains. But thanks to all of you that attended for the Island Corridor presentation.
Thank you. And I'm certainly going to hang out and listen to Mr. Gower's presentation, but thank you for having us here. And we promise we'll get back sooner because you are a stakeholder and you do need to hear from us. So we'll be back.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone opposed to receipt of the Island Corridor Foundation? And that's carried. And we're on to item 2, which is the Comox Valley Chamber of Commerce, Andrew Gower.
Move it.
Grieve and Grant, thank you. And Andrew, are you on the line?
Yes, I'm here, and thank you, Chair and Directors. I've got a slide package. Great. Before I get into my slideshow, I want to just echo and help respond to some of the comments we just had. I'm going to echo Larry's comment. And thank you, Larry, for your presentation. Larry and I have been working together, myself as a representative of the Chamber of Commerce. So I'll back up just one second. Andrew Gower, I'm the Comox Valley Chamber's advocacy chair. I volunteer with the board and assist them with policy. I'm going to talk about policy today. Before I get into the meat of it, there's a few things that really stuck out to me there. Talk about the complexity and risk. And I practice as a civil engineer. I design infrastructure all the time. And I have to completely back up Larry's comment. This is not a very complex project in terms of a rail project. The corridor exists, the rails are there, the bridges are built. It's repairs and upgrades. A lot of them, to be sure, but it's repairs and upgrades. And I would echo Larry's comment about the contingency at 97% being absolutely ridiculous. That's my professional opinion. I'll put a seal on that. I want to talk about some really big kind of view, like worldview ideas before I get into some details that I have. The planning of transportation infrastructure in North America has been fundamentally flawed for at least 100 years. The reason is because we have focused our transportation planning on moving cars and trucks, and we've forgotten about goods and people. So that's the basis of traffic and transportation planning, and we've failed in North America. The other big concept I think I really want, and I talk about this passionately, all transportation infrastructure is subsidized in North America. In fact, around the world. There is no transportation infrastructure that pays for itself. The one exception might actually be rail. the CPR and CNR rail lines aren't that subsidized, and they tend to pay for themselves. Highways never pay for themselves, even toll highways. There's a huge public cost. And the other concept, and this is something I run into when I discuss rail with people say it's not affordable. This isn't a case about what we can afford or not. And I've got some numbers that'll back that up, is what we choose to pay for. And right now in BC and on Vancouver Island, we're choosing not to pay for rail. We're choosing to pay for highways. Next slide, please. So here's what I'm going to go over. Let's let everyone read that for a second. And if Edwin, I can see you, if you can nod that you've read it all, that's great. All right, next slide, please. Let's talk about the BC Chamber of Commerce. So the BC Chamber of Commerce, you can see it's a large organization, 36,000 businesses, 120 local chambers and boards of trade, including ours, all across the province. This is a large voice. And what happens at the annual general meeting every year is local chambers can bring policies. So we call it a policy, is actually like an advocacy position. Now, I've been through this process several times representing the Comox Valley Chamber. And as someone who's a civil engineer and a business owner, I was very impressed. It's a very business case-based process. So any policy that any chamber thinks up, there's got to be a return of investment. You can't just think, oh, it's a great idea. I want to build the biggest ice cream store in the world. Well, if there's no ROI and if it's bad for the environment, the BC Chamber policy process isn't going to support that. It's also a very democratic process. Representatives from all the chambers, empowered by their boards, representing local businesses, vote on all of these policies. And as a chamber locally, the Comox Valley Chamber has been successful in pursuing these policies. So what happens after these policies are agreed by the BC Chamber at the annual general meeting is they go into a big policy booklet that the BC Chamber puts together. And then the BC Chamber spends the next year or two advocating with the appropriate levels of government for those policies. So they're going to go out and in the terms of rail, they're going to talk to the Ministry of Transportation and say, hey, all the businesses in the province think you should do this, so let's do it. So I want to talk about the rail policy we put together, which was actually the text of the delegation report. It was led by the Comox Valley Chamber. So the Comox Valley Chamber Board empowered me to take it to the AGM. And we didn't actually get it through at the AGM because we hadn't had a chance to discuss things with the island chambers. So this process extended past the AGM where we had a special meeting and the policy was finally ratified after the AGM by all the island chambers agreed to this policy and have had input. That's how big the support is in the business community. I think this is a pretty big deal. Local businesses across the province and on the island believe in this policy. And I'll just read out what the recommendations are. So the chamber recommends that the provincial government work with the federal government to ensure, one, that the island corridor remains intact and is designated as a transportation corridor with priority given to rail infrastructure. Two, fund phase improvements and upgrades to the ENN rail corridor to ensure it returns to operation and is capable of providing commuter, and intercity rail service with initial priority on commuter rail service in the Greater Victoria area. And three, commit to ongoing operational funding of the ENN rail service so it can function as a commuter and intercity rail service per the phase improvement plan. So that's the recommendation that the BC Chamber is talking to the provincial government about now. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the costs, because we talked a lot about costs. And here are some numbers, and Larry mentioned some of this. This first one, the Malahat corridor. We, as a province, are spending $150 million on this corridor, about 5 to 7 kilometers of it, between the last 4 or 5 years and the next 2 or 3. So this includes the Mackenzie Interchange, the Mill Bay Village upgrades, and a couple other ones. $150 million. And it still won't be 4 lanes all the way from Mill Bay to Victoria. The Island Highway, that's a great one. That was $1.3 billion. That's a good coincidence there. That's the top price for the rail. And currently, there's a number. The province spends $4.4 billion per year on highway investments. And no one really talks about it. There's no big controversy. But if we want to invest in rail, and Larry just said this really well, suddenly we've got to understand every single little cost and every nuance of it. And that, I believe, is a matter of perception. I did some research into Ireland as a case study to compare to Vancouver Island, and Ireland has a similar population density to the area of Vancouver Island served by the Island Rail Corridor, and they have a very robust intercity and commuter rail system. So there's obvious evidence that it works. So we need to keep these costs in mind of what we spend on highways and what we're spending on the island in comparison to this rail project and who it will serve. Next slide, please. So let's just talk about the basic economics. There were some great questions about this. So that cost to the taxpayer for vehicle kilometer traveled on highways, not insignificant, 18.5 cents. That's for every vehicle and every kilometer they travel on a public highway. So there's the cost of one car, one vehicle on those routes. So I got Nanaimo to Courtenay, Nanaimo to Duncan, and Courtenay, Victoria. That's the subsidy. That's what we pay as taxpayers for those private automobiles to travel on those roads. That doesn't include cost of ownership, insurance, gas, any of that. That's what we pay for the highway. If you compare that to the passenger cost of the West Coast Express from Mission, Vancouver, you can see it's a steal for the taxpayer. The economics, just hands down, they win every time. That's just for passenger rail. Freight costs less, and there's just a trickle-down effect of less costs and environmental impact. Next slide, please. Business opportunities. Larry talked about these too. I like that number, 15,000 freight cars per year. That's a lot of freight. Commuter transit on the South Island obviously can make a big difference, and I believe that benefits everyone on the island because everyone has to go to Victoria at some point. Larry mentioned the port access, which is a huge opportunity. And then there's tourism opportunities. The McLean Mill is a great example of a tourism opportunity we're losing right now because that rail line isn't in service. Next slide, please. Oh, I appear to be missing a slide. I had one on greenhouse gas emissions. All right, that's the next slide. We'll have to come back. My slides are out of order. So here's some numbers for everyone to keep in mind. Comparable, this is per passenger carbon dioxide emissions. You can see how commuter rail compares. And then if we talk about trucks moving freight, it's 4.5 times more CO2 than rail. That's a huge number. And that doesn't even talk about the cost of road building. With trains, you can add more cars and more trains to even a single rail. With roads, you have to add lanes, which take up significantly more space and cost significantly more money. So there's some really big environmental benefits to going with rail. Now we go back a slide to my summary. All right, so that's what we talked about today. I wanted to end with one more thought, because everyone's talking about, oh, it's going to take too long to get to Victoria from Courtenay. So in the research I did, I learned that the peak driving time from just Mill Bay to Victoria It's going to go from the current range of 43 to 73 minutes to 87 to 144 minutes. That means within 20 years, at the peak traffic flows anticipated, just Mill Bay to Victoria is going to add almost 2 hours to your trip. So even with the train moving at the rates it did in its past life, and it's going to be far improved now, suddenly with those increase in traffic times, it's starting to make a lot more sense. So if you increase the speed of the rail, it's going to be hands down the winner to get to Victoria. And the other big idea that I really try to drive home with people when I talk about the rail line is don't think of it in terms of how it was before. And Larry talked about some of the details, but think of the highway system on the island. So I was here in 1994 for the summer, and I went to Victoria on a weekend when I was a young Air Force officer. And it took forever because there's only the one highway, and you would get caught in all the bottlenecks. And since then, look at all the highway expansion that's happened. Unfortunately, we also didn't invest in our rail in the same manner. Now imagine if we had invested in rail in the same manner that we invested in highways. Inland Island Highway, $1.3 billion. So imagine where we would be today with that level of investment in rail. And now we need to picture that going forward. We have to look at this paradigm differently, and we have to, as a society, look at transportation differently. And restoring the rail on Vancouver Island is an incredible way to put that into action. Thank you for your time. I will take any questions now.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. I'll see if there's any questions. Director Arbour.
Thank you. No questions. I just wanted to thank Andrew and Larry for their presentation. And I also want to acknowledge that Charlene Everson from Comox First Nation just joined the board of the ICF last month, and welcome addition. So both her and I will be continuing to represent the Comox Valley at that table. And I really appreciated the time from the presenters today. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Director Hillian.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Andrew. My son, when he was 2, in 1991, actually drove the train from Courtenay to Union Bay, sitting in my lap in the engineer's chair. And that was because we knew somebody who lived in the railway station. It was his birthday, and they said, "Bring him down, and they'll let you ride on the train to Union Bay." Well, they not only let us ride on the train, they let us drive the train, which if the passengers behind us had known, I'm sure it would have caused some concern. But basically the train had 2 levers. One was fast, the other was slow. And then it had a horn that you could pull. Now, this isn't just a sort of whimsical recollection on my part. My son today lives in China, where they have the most modern electric rail system in the world. And I'm just wondering, I don't know if either of you mentioned it today, what the possibility is for electrification of that rail if it ever does come back again, because it strikes me that if we're building a rail system that doesn't measure up to the most modern standards, that really would be a missed opportunity. So I'm wondering if you could comment on whether the upgrades that have been contemplated also consider high-speed electric trains.
So I'll speak in generalities, but I'll see if Larry can answer it with anything more specific. In general, upgrading any train system to electric is one of the most logical things we can do. If you look at a diesel locomotive, it's a diesel electric. Diesel electric locomotives were one of the first hybrid major transportation systems ever invented. So upgrading them to fully electric isn't that big a deal because the drive is already electric. Specific to this rail corridor, I'm going to see if Larry can get off mute and add anything specific about the island corridor. Larry?
Yep, thank you, Andrew, and thank you for your comments, Andrew. So our approach with the province has been essentially to go to them and say, look, we're not going to say that it has to be this or it has to be that. Certainly, there's an opportunity here to electrify it. I mean, this would be easily electrifiable, and if the province chooses to do that, we would certainly be supportive of it. You know, there's a lot of different technologies that are available today. Hydrogen is an example. We're involved in a project with UBC. Dr. Gordon Lovegrove, who is working on hydrogen-driven trains today. and those trains do exist. And there's going to be an opportunity, I think, to do things differently here if the province agrees to do it. We've kind of been banging the drum of the first thing you need to do is protect the corridor, because if you lose the corridor, if you lose the infrastructure, the discussion about hydrogen and electric and flying trains and all that kind of stuff is just a moot point because you don't have a corridor to put it on. So that's kind of the approach we've been taking.
Okay, thank you. Director Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate your presentation and your point about the degree to which we subsidize vehicle transportation without actually thinking about it was quite interesting, and I appreciate the very specific numbers you had there. It was quite enlightening. I wanted to ask, I guess, the other half of Director Gillian's question about high-speed electric rail. About the high-speed part, I think that you heard earlier, sort of, my wondering whether 30 to 40 miles an hour would have the ability to draw people out of their cars and take that option. What impact on a cost do you think it would have to, say, double that speed? We're looking at trains that go more like 60 to 80 miles rather than 30 to 40. Higher speed rail, if not high speed rail. What would that do to the overall cost figures for the corridor?
I don't know if either Larry or I have the data to comment on that at this point. I would say, though, it's definitely feasible and possible. It's going to come down to starting to do incremental improvements to the rail line the way we do incremental improvements to highways. It comes down to that paradigm shift and changing our perspective and looking at transportation in terms of goods and people, and where's the most bang for a buck in terms of goods and people. But like for the time thing, I was just gonna do the math really quickly. If you add those 2 hours basically from Mill Bay to Victoria, I don't see how it's not going to make sense. So right now it's a 2 hour and 40-minute drive, 220 kilometers. That's 140 miles basically. So at 40 miles an hour, what's that? It's under 4 hours. Once you add that hour of driving, so it's 2 hours and 40 minutes now. Well, it's going to be 3 hours and 40 minutes. So it's almost the same at the lower speed we're talking about.
Okay, and in order to, I guess, encourage change, well, it's interesting to realize that it could be competitive on the near end of the time frame rather than waiting 20 years until the Malahat becomes gridlocked, as you're describing, which point it's rail will have a real advantage. Okay, thanks for putting that into perspective. I appreciate that, Andrew.
No problem.
Next, we have Director Grieve.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. Andrew, just to let you know, you can pick on me anytime because we go way back. And I hope you're practicing your saxophone because I'm going to put you on the spot someday and have you play that damn thing. I think what we have to concentrate on here is the future. We're talking about electrification. That's an obvious way to go. But you have to concentrate on the fact that we only get a chance to have that property, that corridor right now. It's irreplaceable. I mean, absolutely irreplaceable. What is the cost of a contingent highway corridor going that far? It just won't happen again. So whatever we can do to make that asset work for us. We talk about rails with trails. We talk about reestablishing some freight service from Port Alberni. We talk about commuter service on the Greater Victoria area. It's a no-brainer. So why don't we support this as much as possible? And I do appreciate Larry and Andrew for your extremely excellent presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, Director Grieve.
Thank you. Now we have Director Hamir.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you to both of you, Larry and Andrew, for your presentations. Andrew, you mentioned that the BC Chamber does meet with the ministries to advocate for the projects. I'm wondering if you can really, have you had any response from any of the BC ministers around this idea?
I'm going to follow up on that because I haven't gotten feedback from the BC Chamber yet. That's a great question.
Okay. And just, from other advocacy work I've done around greenhouse gas reduction, sometimes when I see that, well, what I've found is that the federal government is far more interested right now in reductions of GHGs and can often be one of the levers used to bring funding. So if you're not getting a lot of support from our BC ministers, I don't know, do you have an opportunity to meet with any federal ministers at all?
Yes, because the BC Chamber is part of the Canadian Chamber network. And if it makes sense, we can push this policy up to become a Canadian Chamber policy. I don't know if that would happen because it's kind of a local issue, but there's probably policies dealing with this at the Canadian level. And that's a great point. I'm going to take both those away and do a bit more research.
Okay, great. I think you've answered all our questions. Thanks so much, Andrew, and thanks to everybody, all our guests who participated this evening.
Thank you.
And is there anyone opposed to receipt of the Chamber of Commerce? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried. And we're on to reports. The first item is the 2020 financial statement and audit findings. Grant and Arbor, and I'll pass it over to staff.
Thank you very much, Chair and Directors, and Mariah Fort, the CFO of the Comox Valley Regional District, will present the financial statements and then introduce Corey Vanderhorst of MNP.
Great, thank you, Russell. Through the chair, I am pleased to present to the board the audited financial statements for the 2020 fiscal year. The year-end process is always a significant effort by the finance team and many others to pull together. After a busy and unusual COVID year in 2020 and into 2021, our team went over and above to pull the audit package and statements together. So big thanks to them, as well as to the MMP team to get us to the finish line for our 2020 fiscal year. I will be presenting an overview of the financial statements as compared to 2019 and to the approved 2020 budget. And then Corey Vanderhorst, our audit partner from MMP, will present an overview of the audit findings for the year. The CVRDs with other local governments require significant infrastructure to provide services to the community. This infrastructure requires regular investment and upgrades to maintain and enhance these service levels with aging infrastructure, changing regulations, development and growth, and ongoing demand for service. 2020 was a major year for infrastructure investment with 80 million invested in tangible capital assets, with 74 million of that investment related to the new Comox Valley Water Treatment Plant, of which 46 million of those funds were provided by federal and provincial grants. The $126 million project constructed over the 2019 to 2021 period with commissioning planned for summer 2021 was funded by a mix of grants, reserves, and debt, and will provide potable water to the region for the next 50 plus years and deals with the previous concerns and challenges with boil water advisories in the Comox Valley. The short and long-term debt balances are increasing through this infrastructure investment, particularly for water, solid waste, and the corporate office construction. The utilization of Municipal Finance Authority borrowing at AAA credit rates supported by all BC local governments provides affordable borrowing at the recent 2 to 2.5% range to invest in long-lived infrastructure that provides 20 to 50 years of service life and ensures that both current and future taxpayers fund the cost of infrastructure, providing local government services to the community. The CVRD's financial asset position increased by almost $18 million from 2019. In 2020, we had 141 million of financial assets compared to 2019, 123 million. The cash balance increased from $60 million from 55 to 71 million as we continue to invest in our infrastructure and access short and long-term borrowing for the Municipal Finance Authority, maintaining our fund balances. Liabilities also increased by over 21 million from 2019. 2020 was 138 million compared to 2019, 117 million. Our accounts payable balance increased by $6 million from the previous year to $20 million. And that was related to the significant contractor claims that we received for the water treatment plant on a monthly basis. The regional district short-term debt borrowing varied only slightly, up to 33 million from 30 last year. However, various short-term issues were transferred to long-term in the year. Our long-term debt increased 17 million from 11 million to 28 million. And that was related to the corporate office, which was transferred over to long-term of 8 million. Our Hornby Island Fire Hall, 1.2 million. Our Comox Valley historical landfill closure of 8.2 million. And our Comox Valley curling rink upgrades of $1 million. Our non-financial assets increased by 73 million from 2019. Our value in our infrastructure is up to 245 million in 2020. That's compared to 2019 of 172 million. Our tangible capital asset additions for this year were $80 million. And that was less the 7 million of amortization or the depreciation we take on our assets as we use those assets every year. Again, the major portion of that was related to the new treatment plant with commissioning plans for the summer. Other upgrades related to the wastewater treatment were the Comox Valley Comox pump station upgrades, Comox Valley wastewater treatment phase 1 upgrades, and bioreactor odor control. So we started into all of those projects. Also for solid waste, we started into our regional organics design, as well as our Comox Valley Landfill Public Drop-Off Center. In parks, we did some work on Denman Island Kirk Road Staircase, Gold Road Trail, beach access at Eagles Park, among many other projects. So we've continued to invest significantly in our infrastructure across the region. Our accumulated surplus increased by 69 million from 2019 up to 248 million compared to 179 last year. Again, the majority of this relates to our infrastructure upgrades we continue to do. And our reserves funds decreased from 45 million to 36 million in the year, just with our funds allocated to the capital projects, including the water treatment plant. But we do continue to invest and put funds away into our reserves as we continue on every year. In our statement of operations, the CVRD's revenues increased significantly by 44 million in 2019. So in 2020, we had revenues of 122 million compared to 78 million in 2019. Again, that is related to the grants we received for the water treatment plant of 46 million. Also, you'll see that our actuals are higher than our budget, and that's related to those grants, as well as some DCC funds we use for those projects. So, with the PSAB reporting we do for financial statements, they require us to report on the original budget figures, not amended budget figures. So if we make any amendments to the budget, they're not reflected here. Expenses were just under 53 million compared to 54 in 2019. So we saw a slight decrease actually, and that was related to primarily with COVID. So we did see some decreases in our activity in recreation, in transit, and general government related to COVID activity. Our ending surplus for the year shows at $70 million compared to 24 in this year. And again, that looks like we had a large surplus, but that really relates to how we present the financials and how we fund our capital investment, which is actually in another statement. So moving into cash flows, which tells a bit more of that story, you see that annual surplus. Some highlights of the cash flow statement, that amortization we show there of 6.9 million compared to 6.3. What that is really is through PSAB, all of our infrastructure, we estimate the useful life and service life of those assets, whether it's, park trails of 20 years or water treatment plants and pipes of 50 years. And they ask us essentially to amortize that over its service life. So we're seeing those assets depreciate over time. So all of our accumulated assets, that's what we're showing as a depreciation expense every year. We don't budget that figure. That's just more of an accounting measure, but it's a good target. It's something for us to checkpoint ourselves to and make sure that we're actually investing and budgeting for asset renewal, at least at that level every year. And that makes sure we can maintain those, our infrastructure. So we're showing an $80 million investment compared to 6 million or 7 million of amortization. So I think we're doing pretty good. But again, as we focus on asset management, we really want to make sure that we're maintaining those assets, maximizing their life, but also to making sure we can maintain those service levels. You can see those fluctuations we're seeing in the long-term and short-term debt. So as I spoke to, we're shifting from kind of, we use short-term debt financing as we do construction. It's a good borrowing model to access that fund when you need it. And then when you're done and looking at the rates and the service, that's where you look to target to transfer to either spring or fall borrowing with MFA. So you can see those shifts as I spoke to with the corporate office, the landfill and that sort of thing. So you see that shift over to long-term debt from short-term. But we did actually access some short-term debt this year for the water treatment plant construction financing. As you saw, I believe it was in May, we presented to you 20 million of that water treatment borrowing. We shifted to long-term in the fall because the rates are good right now. And also too, we want to minimize that construction financing, that interest costs we're accumulating before we move to long-term repayment models. So again, we're managing our debt. It is a core funding strategy for us. It really makes sure that we can make sure there's that fairness and affordability to citizens for services, but we also want to take a look at the interest rates where they're falling and also the best timing to transfer over to long-term. Overall, we're ending where our cash position is increasing up to 16 million. And again, it's sort of that kind of mix of strategy when we look at our funding. We're maximizing grants, we're maximizing our reserve funds, and we're also using debt where we can. So I think we're holding our position. In summary, the financial statements for 2020 show that we're in a strong financial position to continue to build on. We are growing as a region. We have major service demands. We're focusing on the water treatment plant, the sewer conveyance. We're really kind of setting up foundational infrastructure for the region for the next 50 years. So we want to make sure we're in good stead for that, as well as make sure we can meet the ongoing demands of service and work with our stakeholder and our regional partners to provide good service to the community. So as we move into long-term financial planning, which is a big plan of ours for 2022, and looking to our asset management implementation, we're really sort of setting that path to make sure we have sustainable service delivery through the strategic investment in core infrastructure as a primary, financial stability policies and frameworks, over our reserves, our debt, grant management, to ensure that we can use funds efficiently and strategically use those funds. So that we can provide reliable and affordable services in the short and long term. So I think, that's what's kind of, we're really looking forward to present to you this year for the 2022 financial plan, is moving to that kind of next path and ensuring we're sustainable today and tomorrow. So I'm happy to take any questions on the financial statements if you have any.
Thanks, Mariah. Are there any questions before we go to Corey? I don't see any. Great job.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll pass it over to Corey for his presentation.
Great, thank you.
Welcome, Corey.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. A big thank you to Mariah and her team for all your help with the audit this year. It's a lot to put together, and we are still doing a lot of things remotely and limiting time in the office or in your offices. Nice to be seeing some changes coming, but the reality is back in March and April when we were still working under the provincial health orders at that time and restricting some of our interactions. Happy to say that another clean audit opinion for the regional district this year. Really no changes from our audit plan. We used a materiality number of $2 million that was communicated in the audit service plan. Again, a reminder that is a percentage of your annual revenues. That drives the amount of testing we do. We look at anything over that amount. So a lot of that capital projects that Mariah was discussing, we were testing all of those invoices and looking at all those progress draws. And then we sample underneath to give ourselves comfort that the financial statements are materially accurate. So there are no other items, nothing unusual noted, nothing to bring to the board's attention here tonight. Again, we're not specifically looking for fraud or looking for anything, but if something came to our attention, we are required to report out to the board. Yeah, and so the final step for us on our audit process is approval of the financial statements here tonight, and then we will happily provide our final audit reports to Mariah. I'm also happy to take any questions that the board may have on the audit process or the audit results for this year.
Okay, thank you. Again, I don't see anybody's hand up, but I do want to say thanks to you, Corey, and to Mariah and staff, because this year has been quite crazy and a lot of uncertainties, and we've had a lot of big capital projects, as Mariah talked about, and we've made it through really well. We reviewed all our services, we found savings, we saw through reduced revenues in transit and in recreation. And, it looks like we're in a really good financial position. And I just really want to extend my thanks to staff for that. And so we are on receipt still. Anyone opposed to receipt? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried. Okay, Hillian and Grant. And the recommendation is that the financial statements for CVRD for the year ending December 31st, 2020 be approved. Is there anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried unanimously. Thank you. So moving on, item 2 is Comox Valley Recreation Committee minutes from May 25th. Grant and McCullum, thank you. Any discussion about the minutes? And is there anyone opposed to receipt? Hearing and seeing none, that is carried. We're on to item 3, Electoral Area Service Committee, June 14th minutes. Oh, sorry, not minutes. There's consideration of recommendations. So yeah, moving recommendation number 1. Grant and Morin, thank you. And recommendation number 1 is regarding Union Bay water billing, and Director Arbor.
Yeah, I just want to note, for obviously the board is aware, but for the public as well, these 5 recommendations relate to basically the Union Bay Improvement District transition, and we're, thanks to staff and our working group and the Union Bay Improvement District employees that are now becoming part of the CVRD fold, we're making good headway in advancing the bylaws that will allow the CVRD to proceed from here on out. And for the board's interest, June 30th, we'll have a small event as well to note that on July 1st, we'll be taking over management of those services.
Great, thanks for that background. So have we had a first and second for recommendation 1? Yes. And is there anyone opposed? It's a vote of the full board. Hearing and seeing none, that is carried. Grant and Hamir move recommendation 2. Any further discussion? Again, it's a vote of the full board. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that is carried. Grant and McCullum move recommendation 3 regarding the parcel tax rule review. Again, a vote of the full board. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that is carried. On to recommendation 4. Grant and Hillian, thank you. And this is regarding the water regulations bylaw. Vote of the full board. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried.
Move 5.
Grieve and Grant. Moved recommendation 5 regarding fire service administration. Again, vote of the full board. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried. Now we're on to item 4, which is a report regarding ending the BC Climate Action Review Incentive Program. Hillian and Grant, thank you. And I'll pass it to staff.
Thank you very much, Chair and Directors, and Robin Holm, our long range planner, is here to present this report and the recommendation and answer any of your questions.
Welcome, Robin.
Thank you. Good afternoon through the chair and to the directors. Staff are here this afternoon to talk to you about the end of the current program. On May 11th, the province announced that the CARE program would be ending, with 2020 being the last year for reporting and 2021 being the final year to receive funding. As you know, the CARE program is a conditional grant program that provides funding to local governments that have signed the BC Climate Action Charter. And the funding equals 100% of the carbon tax that a local government pays to support support their operations. And since the charter was first launched in 2007, 187 out of 190 local governments have signed the charter And this has provided the province with a comprehensive database of local corporate emissions. The program requires local governments to report their local corporate emissions, and this encourages local governments to work towards carbon neutrality. The cancellation of the program has two key implications. The first being that this is a loss of sustained funding. The CVRD has participated in this program since 2007 and has provided an annual dedicated source of funding. And just to put some numbers to this, since 2010, the CVRD has received just over 490,000 in funding from this. And annually, this works out to be in about, in 2020, the funding amounted to just over 45,000. And some examples of the projects that have been carried out at the CVRD with this funding include the Cool It climate leadership training, the promotion of the former Scrap It program. We've done a lot of promotion of the Clean BC rebate programs, as well as the municipal top-up rebates. And then most recently, the establishment of our Road to 2030 project, which is a community granting program, which is designed to incentivize local residents to reduce local emissions. And it also should be noted that the current projects for 2021 work program, will not be impacted, but future projects in the 2022 budget planning will need to account for the loss of revenue. CAREB has been a valuable source of consistent and dedicated funding for more than a decade, and local governments have come to rely on this funding to undertake local climate change action initiatives to work towards reducing GHG emissions. A replacement program is needed to support the CVRD and other local governments to undertake these sorts of projects. And it should be noted that, that if the province were to move towards a grant, an application-based funding program through UBCM, as mentioned in the announcement, that more resources and staff time are required to develop project proposals and prepare grant applications, and that the funding from these programs are not consistent, and therefore it can be challenging to develop work programs and implement multi-year projects. And so this brings me to the second key implication, and that's the loss of coordinated reporting and data. As CAREB does encourage local governments to carry out this work, until recently, the CVRD has used an Excel spreadsheet to manually input our data on our annual corporate energy use. But just this year, the CVRD purchased a license to the software Sophie. And this will allow us to measure and track our corporate emissions. And this will support the CVRD in standardizing our reporting and data analysis on our corporate emissions and provide key insights into where we can reduce our energy use. So in terms of next steps, there may be a silver line in the cancellation of this program, and that would be an opportunity for improvements. Local governments have identified shortcomings in the program. For example, funding is based on fossil fuel consumption, and this may be perceived as rewarding a lack of progress. So in order to move forward, staff recommends sending a letter to the Premier and the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy and UBCM, outlining that the value of the program has to the CVRD, the associated grant funding, and these implications that I have just run through. Local governments should be engaged and consulted with on the design and implementation of a replacement program that offers a dedicated and sustained funding to support these climate actions locally. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Robin. Are there any questions for staff? Director Hamir.
Thanks so much, Robin, for that report. And you know, while it's sad to see that the funding canceled and all the investment that we've made into that software, I'm wondering though if that software purchase is still helpful for staff, because I know this board has asked, you know, for us to keep an account of our GHGs, and do you think you will be able to continue using that software without support from this funding?
Through the chair to Director Hamir, yes, it is our intention to to continue to use this software. As I mentioned, it does provide really valuable insights, and it really helps us to be able to track it in such a way that we were never able to have that sort of, we'll be able to upload data automatically from many of our utility providers. And in this way, moving forward, we're going to have really accurate information, and this will help us to be able to see where we can make improvements.
Thank you. Oh, Director Hillian put his mic off. Okay. His question was answered. All right. So we're on receipt. Anyone opposed to receipt? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried. And there's a recommendation.
Move the recommendation.
Director Grant and Cole Hamilton. Any further discussion? It's that we write a letter to the Premier and the ministers. It's about the full board. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that is carried. Thank you. Okay, so we're moving on to item 5, which is Department of National Defense Agreement for Mutual Firefighting Assistance. Hillian and Moran, thank you. And I'll pass it to staff.
Thank you very much, Chair and Directors. And Deputy Marzo, General Manager of Community Services, is on the line, and he will present this report and the recommendation and answer any of your questions.
Good afternoon, through the Chair to Directors. I'm here to present the mutual aid agreement between the D&D, Department of National Defense, and the CVRD. This is largely a renewal agreement from expired agreement in 2019. That agreement was originally signed in 2014. Some key items to consider in this agreement included has been reviewed by the CVRD solicitors. It's really about requesting assistance, especially for specialized equipment and also mutual aid support amongst the CVRD departments as well as municipalities. And it has a financial provision for mutual response rates, which generally mirror each other. So it's fairness and equitable in that form. And it provides broad opportunities for training on equipment as well. So overall, we see this agreement as beneficial for our organizations, fire departments, as well as the D&D if they require support in the future. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Any questions? No, I don't see any. Thanks for the report, Doug. And we're on receipt. Anyone opposed to receipt? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried.
Second.
Hillian and Grieve. And the recommendation is that we enter into agreement for mutual firefighting assistance with DND. And it's above the full board. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that is carried unanimously. And we're on to bylaws and resolutions. For first, second, and third reading, item 1 is bylaw number 661, the Union Bay Water Tools bylaw. Grant and McCullum. And it's above the full board for first and second reading. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried. Grant and Moran for third reading. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that is carried. We're on to item 2, bylaw 622. This is for Fire Service Administration for first and second reading. Grant and Hamir, both the full board. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that is carried. Grant and McCullum have moved third reading. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that is also carried. We're on to item 3, which is bylaw number 663, the Union Bay Parcel Tax Bylaw. Grant and Moran have moved first and second reading. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried. Grant and Hillian have moved third. Anyone opposed? That is carried. We're on to item 4, which is bylaw number 664.
Move first and second.
Grieve and Grant have moved first and second of the water use and distribution regulation bylaw. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried. Grant and McCullum have moved third. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that is carried. We're on to bylaws for adoption. Item 5 is bylaw 654, which is economic development service conversion bylaw. Grant and Hamir. This is for adoption and the vote of full board. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that is carried. And item 6 is bylaw number 653. It's the security issuing bylaw. Director Hillian and Grant have moved for adoption. And it's the both full board. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that is carried. Item 7 is bylaw 655. It's the regional district security issuing bylaw. And Director Hillian and Grant have moved for adoption. Vote the full board. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that is carried. And we're on to new business. Under new business, we have the first item is Mosaic Forestry Activities, and it's correspondence from Director Arbor.
Move correspondence.
Grieve and Grant, thank you. And I will pass it over to Director Arbor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll just take a minute to add a little bit to the letter. This came as a very late surprise in the last couple of weeks, so I've had to spend some time in even after writing the letter to the board, and I thank the board for considering my request today. For those of you who have read the papers, I think there's been comments by Mosaic Forestry that UBIT and the CVRD had expressed no concern about logging in the Langley Lake watershed. I would like to set the record straight that the Union Bay Improvement District has a decades-long standing opposition to any logging in the watershed by UBIT trustees and otherwise. There has been protests in the past. So I don't know how the company came to the conclusion that in regarding these types of activities that there was no concern. And I was not, they definitely heard concern from myself. So I think I'm a director of CVRD, and I would also express that that has definitely been expressed to them. Past harvesting has led to high turbidity events and diminished increased stress and impact on the water system of Union Bay. Langley Lake is a tiny lake in a very small watershed. I have yet to meet a single person in favor of logging a Langley Lake watershed in Union Bay. In 2017, Comox First Nation called out logging in Langley Lake watershed, calling it unacceptable and calling out the province in regards to unacceptable regulations. Many local and regional governments are also expressing deep concerns around harvesting in drinking watersheds, as this board is very well aware of. And I do wonder if the company is planning these cut blocks, because currently the private managed forest lands legislation is under review, and a number of local governments have made submissions, including your very own Comox Valley Regional District. Our submission highlighted the following concerns. That as part of the PMFL, the Private Managed Forest Land Legislation Review, we should move to parcel by parcel impact on forest hydrology and managing overlapping public resources. So I have not seen a plan that seems satisfactory to those concerns in regards to Langley Lake. We made a comment that increased land holding by one organization should come with increased responsibility. In Area A, by my estimate, Mosaic has close to 40,000 hectare playground. Langley Lake is about 700 hectares. I don't understand why they would focus on activities at this sensitive time, just as we started a new water treatment plant in the area. Another part of our submission, regulations should be significantly increased to at least match Crown land regulations So basically what we're seeing in private lands is a lower level of regulations, and on the east side of Vancouver Island, many of our drinking watersheds are affected. The next one is important. We highlighted that the designation of community watersheds should apply to drinking watersheds to public and private lands. Forestry activities should be held to a much higher standard in community watershed. Unfortunately, Langley Lake doesn't benefit from either. It's not considered a community watershed, which is a historical tragedy, really, that should be rectified as part of the legislative review. Riparian retention is inadequate in the current regulations. And lastly, the company highlighted the number of professionals that have looked at this, but our submission was a professional reliance model is not appropriate for large-scale forestry and community watersheds where the consequence of poor management impact a large number of people. Third-party oversight is needed. If you'll indulge me for one more minute. The Mosaic submitted a letter, which I appreciate. I think they have really good people working there, and I appreciate their professionalism. They sent a letter to our board, and I do value that input. But I would like to highlight that their plan to come and present in the same breath, they say that the logging would happen in June this month. So it's not a question of talk and log, it's a question of log and talk. The map that you see on page 8 of their, on page 6 of their submission doesn't show the lake, even though it's right at the edge of what should be in that figure. And where the activities are, actually at the end of the lake where the water intake is. So when we talked about Perseverance Creek and all those things earlier, this is the situation. So my question, I actually have a question to CVRD staff. You know, it's stated that neither UBIT or CVRD had expressed concern. And you know, at what point would we express concern, especially considering the veracity of our comments to the PMFL review? And I'd be curious to see what entered in the staff's rationale and if we did provide a no concern, basically stamp on the plan activities. I would really like the board to, I mean, I'll welcome comments and questions, but I think I have all of Union Bay behind me in saying that we really hope that the board will support the proposed action, which is simply to send a letter to Mosaic to defer their plan activities, and second, to engage the province and push them around the PMFL review. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Before I go to questions, there is the letter from Mosaic in the further in the agenda. We might want to receive the director's correspondence and then bring that letter forward so that we can discuss it all at once. So we'll move receipt and then we can, yeah.
There is a resolution on the floor to receive the correspondence.
Yes.
You might want to discuss the director's comments and concerns, and then before you go to considering the recommendations, then receive the Mosaic report, just so everything can be debated and discussed in advance of making a commitment or a decision.
Okay, so we'll take questions for Director Arbor, then we'll move to receive the letter from Mosaic. Okay, Director Grant.
Yes, thanks. So I spoke with the owners of Kensington Properties or Union Bay Estates or whatever they're calling it now, and they have concerns over this too. You know, if they're going to put a treatment plant in down there, they're concerned of the timing of all of this and everything. And so my question is, do we have jurisdiction over any of this? I don't believe we do. This would be like they can just go ahead. And so our request is simply to say, hey, slow down. Could you come and talk to us first? Is that, am I correct with that? Okay. I just wanted to be clear with that.
Thank you, Director Hamir.
Thank you. You know, I fully support Director Arbor in this. And I think for future management, even though it's not under our jurisdiction until the beginning of July, it will be, and this is something we're going to have to inherit. So fully support asking Mosaic to delay their logging. My question though was around that one statement that Director Arbor made around the watershed designation and that there's an oversight. I don't know if staff have any insight into this, or Director Arbor, what is needed to designate Langley Lake as a watershed? Is that something that the province has to designate? I assumed everyone knew that if you're taking water out of a lake, it's a watershed, but didn't realize that it has to be designated by.
Madam Chair, I don't have the answer, nor do staff, to that at this time, but we could easily get back to you in terms of what would need to be done or otherwise, or what the history is on that.
Okay, if that could be done, and I don't know if this is a separate, but seeing as, you know, we're starting to book meetings with ministers at UBCM, if this is an item that we would also like to discuss with the relevant minister around that watershed designation, it sounds like it makes sense that we bring it to their attention, that there's a deficiency there.
Yeah, just to add that we had a council meeting last night in Cumberland, so we're having similar issues with Allen Lake, which is the drinking water supply for Cumberland, or part of. And we, after many years of asking to speak to the Ministry of Forests and having the same discussion over and over, we have opted to try and get a meeting with the Premier. And so the discussion was that we would also invite Director Arbor to that meeting if we could get it. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't advocate directly from the regional district as well. Director Arbor?
Yeah, thank you, and good question from Dr. Amir and comments from Chair Kettler. Today, I started an email exchange with the PMFL, the contact for the PMFL program in the Forest Tenures branch, and ask about where the review was at, because the submission that the Comox Valley Regional District made is supported. I read all the other submissions from all the way from the Capital Regional District and municipalities, and we're all singing the same things, that the regulations affecting PMFL are far substandards in the 21st century context, where we're supposed to manage for multiple values and water quality is at stake for many of our residents. I think that it's a good time to engage in those discussions, but I'm really stunned that this is happening now in terms of our tiny Langley Lake watershed. Before the PMFL review is completed, perhaps there's a fear by the company that if regulations are changed, they would not be able to access that kind of timber in the future. But I think it's an old issue that's been locked for a long time, and it has a very strong lobby for the status quo. And for me, in my backyard like that, and hearing the history around Cumberland, I think we need to really advocate both with the province, with the company, and also with our neighborhood jurisdictions, which is the second requested action, that we bring people together to have a discussion around changing what has been sort of a broken model, I think, for communities for a while.
Thank you. Any further comments, questions? So we're on receipt of Director Arbor's correspondence. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried. And so we can have a motion to consider item I, the letter from Mosaic. Grant and Mir, thank you. Anyone opposed to considering the letter? And I don't see any, so we will move that letter up to be considered now. And then I will need a motion to receive the letter. Grant and McCullum, thank you. So is there any discussion on the Mosaic letter? Okay. Yeah, I think that, you know, from my experience in the last few years with the forestry companies, it's been really a good exchange in some ways because of the land use agreements that we have in Cumberland. But I think it's really a fault of the province that those regulations are not up to standard, and not even up to the Crown forestry standards. So we need to do more, I think, to push this issue, because I think the province has kind of pitted local governments against forestry companies who are responsible to purvey good quality water, and we spend millions of dollars to do so. At the same time, the forestry companies are logging in a manner that is not conducive to good watershed management, and that needs to be brought to the province to deal with. Director Hillian?
Thanks, Chair. Beyond receiving the letter, would it be the intent to request that they present? And I'm just asking for clarification because I'm not sure what order we want to do things in here in terms of the actions that are requested in relation to the larger concern, and how bringing them to the table might dovetail with that.
Yeah, I think a request to present would be appropriate. Director Arbour?
Yeah, I definitely support that. And just for the board's information, I and staff have been invited this week for a small tour with Mosaic. So I have definitely agreed to that. But I think I welcome the requested action for them to come and present as well.
Okay, so we're on receipt of the letter. Anyone opposed to receipt? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried. Director Hillian?
Thanks, Chair. I'll move that we ask the Mosaic representatives to present to an upcoming regional district board meeting.
Okay, seconded by Director Hamir. Any further discussion? And is there anyone opposed to the motion? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried unanimously. And there are two requested actions from Director Grant and Moran. Moving action 1, which is to write to Mosaic requesting that the company suspend its harvesting activities in Langley Lake watershed until 2023. And further, that between now and then, the regional district invite Mosaic to work together to explore the watershed conservation plan.
And Madam Chair and Directors, just a word of advice, and that is, please understand that we are not yet responsible for the services of the improvement district. That is to come. But when it does come, we gain their policies, their work plan, their budget that exists already. And there's not a lot there in terms of resourcing a watershed conservation plan. If that means work and expense on the part of the regional district, we're going to have to work with the community to meet their expectations, but that may require additional resources. And as you are aware, regional district services must pay for the services that they consume and require. So I just, in terms of us going down this road, there will be a need for that to be resourced if the regional district is going to be supporting some form of conservation plan for the watershed.
Thank you. Okay, so the motion is on the floor. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried. And there's Grant and McCollum have moved requested action number 2, which is for us to invite relevant Vancouver Island jurisdictions and the province to a sharing session and discussion about management of public drinking watersheds. Any further discussion? And it's below the full board. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried unanimously. Thank you. And we're on to item 2, investment management policy. McCollum and Hillian. Oh. And we'll pass it to Director McCollum. Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Chair. I'll just briefly speak to the letter submitted. Basically, this letter comes out of the fact that our board has made addressing the climate crisis a priority. And there's really no reason why this shouldn't extend to how our reserves are invested. Many charitable organizations, universities, and even BC's largest union, CUPE, have enacted policy to start the process of divestment from fossil fuels in recent years. It's become increasingly feasible for organizations like ours to access investment products that provide fossil fuel-free or ESG filters. And enacting policy that speaks to these factors in addition to capital preservation and revenue generation help to drive demand for further investment products that fit this criteria. I also want to underscore that taking this step does not represent a decrease to investment revenues. The fossil fuel sector has not performed well over recent years. In fact, it has significantly underperformed against renewables for each of the last 10 years, sometimes by as much of a factor of 1 to 3. Including these considerations when purchasing investment products is a prudent and risk-averse approach to managing our financial resources. And I hope that the board will agree with that assertion and support my motion.
Thank you, Director. Any questions, Director Arbour?
Yeah, thanks to Director McCollum. This is awesome. And I'm not surprised you're the one bringing it forward with the finance background. Do you have any comments as to some of the trends that exist in other local governments following this? I think you're our MFA rep now. So if you can comment a little bit on where we'll situate ourselves in relation to others.
Yeah, to answer that, it's their larger local government have taken bigger strides and started that process earlier, which is it's part of what enables us as a smaller organization to kind of follow that lead. City of Vancouver, I believe, first initiated that conversation with MFA, and realistically, almost all local government is receiving a lot of the support for their investments through MFA. So it wasn't until enough larger organizations stepped forward and expressed an interest in these products that MFA could feasibly deliver something like a fossil fuel-free bond, which was attached with the letter, just a little bit of information there. Other local governments haven't gone so far as to set it out in policy, but have submitted letters to MFA requesting these type of products so that they can also have these options in place. So there's a spectrum, but it's definitely becoming more and more part of the conversation. And these things did certainly come up at the MFA AGM. It's where the conversation is moving when it comes to investments and the fact that there's many local governments in BC that have recognized the climate crisis. So it's definitely in keeping with that.
Great, thank you. So we are on receipt. Is there anyone opposed to receipt? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried, and there's a requested action.
Second.
Hamir and Arbour. And it's a very long motion, so I won't read it, but it's on the screen. And is there any further discussion? And it's above the full board. Anyone opposed? Director Grant is opposed. And that's carried. Thank you. So moving on, we have item 3, which is the UBCM ministers meetings. Thank you, Arbour and Grant. And yeah, this was brought up earlier that UBCM is coming up in September. And the week previous to that is when the ministers make themselves available for meetings. I just wanted to reach out to the board and see if there is anyone that wants to bring up any topics. And it doesn't have to be on the spot tonight. You can email myself and staff and we can arrange that. But Director Morin, go ahead.
Great, thanks, Chair. Could you refresh my memory on how many meetings we generally do with the RD and just to get a sense of that, because I do have an item, but I know that we prioritize depending, there's all kinds of things we want to talk about. So
I'll pass that to staff.
Sure. In my experience, probably 3 to 4 is the average that we have. Generally, they've been topics that have been burning issues that it's ready for consideration by the minister, and then staff will support the board's decision or the priorities in terms of preparing the background reports and such.
Mhm. Well, I mean, I guess the a topic that comes to mind is just in light of, and it may not be a priority for this board per se, but I think that it's worth putting it out there in terms of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls and some of the asks of First Nations folks in our community is to do advocacy, going to government, provincial and federal governments to help the communities investigate and document children who died or went missing, and to go from the frankly pathetic 8 out of 94 Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action that have been implemented. And I really think that it's important for all local governments to take leadership on this, because if not our voices, then whose voices can really kind of put the coals to the feet of the higher governments. The other piece of the request is demand search of all residential schools on Mark Gray. So I'm just putting that out there, whether we do it in this way with minister, but I think it is something that we need to take some action on. I'm hoping this board will support. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I was also thinking about, you could meet with crowd corporations and other organizations, including RCMP, and was thinking that it would be good for us to meet with RCMP and talk about institutional change and cultural sensitivity and sort of being on the same page. I don't know that they get that many requests, but I think that would be a good one for us to do, considering all that's happening and some of the stories that have come out recently. Director Arbor?
Thanks, and I will speak in support of both those ideas. And my idea will seem a little more, just practical, I guess, but not practical, but just down to the ground. As chair of the Rec Commission, last year we had a great meeting. There is such thing as recreation and sports at the province. You have to read the Ministry of Tourism's Arts, Culture, and Sports. And so we had a really good meeting. I felt just talking about how a lot of local government are left on their own when it comes to recreation spending, and we're not seeing it's grant opportunity based. So we have to make internal decisions around allocations. And in the post-COVID era, really that question is whether there's interest by senior government in having a strong relaunch around recreation and sports in the province. So I think it would be good to keep the conversation going.
Great. All right, and if there's any, Director Hillian.
Thanks, Chair. This is a spur of the moment, and maybe the staff already feels this advocacy has been done, but I'm wondering if requesting to meet with the appropriate minister around the South Sewer funding issue would be worthwhile.
Okay, thank you. Director Grant.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, maybe Russell can help me with this, but I know we've got in Comox just like a laundry list of things that people want to talk to the ministers with. And in my opinion, these meetings are really for, like, if you have your water project and you're looking for the money and you're trying to push it over the edge, because you've only got a very short period of time with these people. And not that these issues aren't really great, and the ones that we want to bring are all good issues. I'm just wondering if there isn't a better way than when you've got this, 10 to 15 minutes, like it's just going to get lost on them. They're just running these meetings, they're churning them out. And I've always thought that you wanted to really have the one where you could push it over the edge or get their attention on one thing. And if there isn't a better way to do some of this truth and reconciliation and other things rather than doing it at a 10-minute or 15-minute meeting with a minister in amongst 20 other meetings that they're having. I'm just questioning whether this is the right venue to do those kinds of things at, or if there isn't a better way.
Yeah, I mean, it is that sort of elevator pitch style meeting. But I think being able to bring those topics and have them top of mind in the minister's minds is really important. And I think if it's coming from multiple local governments, it just makes that much more of an impact. So I'm not averse to bringing up those topics in this style of meeting. I don't know what other people at the board feel on that. Director Hillian?
Thanks, Chair. There's also a view that these meetings are less crucial for Vancouver Island municipal governments than perhaps those from other parts of the province who don't have the accessibility to Victoria that we do. Mind you, the pandemic has changed all that. I will point out, though, that we're about to have our second meeting with the Attorney General and Minister responsible for housing this week. That'll be 2 meetings in a month. And I think the more you can press your issues with these folk, the better. But to some extent, I do agree with Director Grant that it's probably more effective if it's a specific ask that needs that level of intervention to push it over the top. While at the same time, I recognize that adding our voice to the concerns that have been expressed is certainly important. But sometimes you do have to pick your spots and use your time effectively. Thanks.
Thank you. Director Arbour.
Yeah, thanks. And last year, my experience, Dr. Grant's point, was when we prepared for the sports meeting, staff had actually a relationship with their staff. And so they added topics in that preparation that were a little bit more pointed around things that we would like support with at the local government. So I expect it'll be the same. I'd like to mention, I didn't bring up, despite my my earlier item, the Ministry of Forests, because I did hear Chair Cutler mention that Cumberland is planning to maybe invite me with the Premier or Minister of Forests, and I'll gladly take up that offer and not take RD resources for that. Thanks.
Thank you, Director Hamir.
Thanks. I did bring this up with staff, but I just wanted to make the board aware that the ask was sort of sent for a meeting with the Minister of Ag to thank them for the funding that they gave us for the food hub, to make them aware of the ag area plan that we're doing. And then, potentially that there is an opportunity to do some work with the school food programs that we have here in the Comox Valley that are needing a bit of support coordination wise. So.
Great, thanks for that. And I think that we can work on honing our messages and having more specific asks with staff, and I can send that information out to the board. Okay, so I guess there's receipt of my report. We're still on receipt. And is there anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried. Thank you. Hillian and Hamir, the full board. Anyone opposed to the addendum being considered? Yeah, we've already done number 1. So, oh yes, both 2 and 3. And anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried. So we move to addendum item 2, which is the Electoral Area Service Committee Financial Plan Budget Amendments. Arbour and Grant, and there is no receipt. Yeah, it's just the recommendation. So Arbour and Grant have moved the recommendation. Does staff want to speak to it?
No, just that this is a recommendation from the EA committee. They considered this and as required for works on and Goose Spit. And Doug is on the line if you have any specific questions about it.
Okay. It's regarding Moose Spit, and is there any questions? I don't see any, and it's a vote of the areas. Is there anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried. And we're on to item 3, which is the response to a delegation from Friends of Strathcona. Director Hillian and Director Grant, thank you. And this was brought forward by Director Grieve. Director Grieve, would you like to speak to it?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not too much, only in that we have to offer whatever support we can give the organization. I know they are working in a Class A provincial park, which has a lot of funding, but I do think that their particular initiative speaks to something more local that includes us and Strathcona Regional District. So I'm just hoping we can at least offer a letter of support. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Director Hillian.
Thanks, Chair. I know this is going to be supported, but I just want to add that I think they brought up some really important issues that relate to our general concerns about the overcrowded nature of many of our recreational areas. And I think Tourism Vancouver Island should be appraised of this as well, because as we can see in all the correspondence we're getting on the Saratoga Beach or Saratoga Speedway issue, there's lots of views out there about the numbers of people that are going to continue to come to the island, the increasing tourism of all varieties. And there's no question that more access points to the park is something most worthy of exploration and some resources being devoted to. Thanks.
Absolutely, thank you. Okay, we're on receipt. Anyone opposed to receipt? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried. Grant and Arbor, the requested action is that the board provide a letter of support for the Friends of Strathcona Park for grant funding opportunities. It's a vote of the full board. Anyone opposed? Hearing and seeing none, that's carried. Thank you. We will move in camera.